This talk will describe how unsupervised domain adaptation and feature fusion can be used to perform shadow-agnostic tree crown detection from RGB and thermal drone imagery in a novel method we term ShadowSense. Detecting individual tree crowns from remote sensing data is important for many applications, like forest inventory and disease monitoring. Typical RGB-only detectors work well for trees in ideal lighting conditions, but are prone to missing poorly illuminated trees hidden in the shadows of their taller neighbors. These shadow trees are, however, visible in thermal, as marked in the top right over here, and missing these trees can cause problems for tasks like forest inventory, where we want an accurate count of the number of trees in a forest stand. So the goal in this work is to leverage the complementary information available from both of these modalities to detect visible as well as shadow trees. The catch, however, is that we want to do this without any ground truth annotations, even for RGB, and instead we only have to rely on the co-registered nature of the imagery. The RGB-only baseline detector used in this work is Deep Forest, which is based on the single modality RetinaNet architecture, and it has been trained through fully supervised learning. As I just showed, its performance off the shelf is good for visible trees, but it misses a number of shadow trees and requires arduous manual annotation for further fine-tuning. Alternative approaches to this problem that fall under unsupervised domain adaptation typically require source domain annotations and tend to discard the higher contrast RGB images after adaptation. Early image level fusion and image-to-image translation methods may also be applied, but these are prone to artifacts. On the other hand, the proposed method fuses deeper level features from both modalities to combine complementary information after adaptation. The diagram on this slide visualizes the proposed approach ShadowSense, which consists of two parallel branches based on the RetinaNet architecture, each comprising a ResNet 50 feature extractor and a feature pyramid network, or FPN. The detection heads are shared between both of these branches, and since RetinaNet expects 3-channel image inputs, we also prepend a 1x1 convolutional layer to map the 1-channel thermal images to 3 channels. As shown in the orange box to the left, foreground and background regions are differentiated using binary masks that are generated through an intensity-based watershed segmentation, followed by some morphological operations like opening and closing. The baseline model weights are loaded into both of these branches, but the RGB one is frozen, while only the thermal branch is trained using 2 components: domain adversarial training, shown in green, and foreground FPN feature alignment, shown in purple. So domain adversarial training is modeled as 2-player min-max optimization. 3 domain discriminator CNNs are trained to distinguish between the domain labels of ResNet 50 feature maps at 3 different levels, while the thermal branch is trained to generate domain invariant features and fool the discriminators. Using gradient reversal layers in between them that act as the identity function in the forward pass and negate gradients in the backward pass allows us to train this component simultaneously. Unlike previous domain adversarial training works, we don't include any task-aware detection loss since we don't have any ground truth annotations. Instead, foreground FPN feature alignment is used to guide the adaptation during training. The figure on the right here demonstrates this process for the M3 level as an example, and here you can see that the same mask is applied to both of the feature maps, and then straightforward MSE loss is computed at only the foreground regions. The total loss is then the sum of this value over all 5 levels of the FPN. Along with DAT, this component ensures that the same FPN features are produced at the foreground regions for visible tree crowns, regardless of the modality by both of the branches. And the whole thermal branch is trained end-to-end using both LFPN on this slide and then the DAT losses in the previous slide. After training is complete, the thermal branch has been adapted to produce domain invariant features relative to the RGB branch. During inference, fusion is performed only for the background FPN regions to leverage complementary information. With the M2 level as an example here, the thermal feature map is first masked, and then the background regions are averaged pointwise in a straightforward weighted manner that favors thermal. The foreground values are the same as those in the RGB feature map. Then, the fused feature map is passed to the pre-trained frozen detection heads to obtain bounding box predictions. In this work, we additionally prepared and released a large-scale dataset of registered RGB thermal drone imagery, which we call RT trees. We use this dataset to train ShadowSense and evaluate performance as well. The data was collected from a cut block in a mixed forest stand in Alberta, Canada, as shown in this figure on the top right over here. And we used a DJI M300 drone mounted with an H20T sensor that takes both thermal and wide-angle RGB images. In total, 14 flights over the same area were conducted from July to November of 2022. In each, around 800 images were taken and co-registered for more precise geometric alignment. So as shown in the plot to the right, GPS was used to split the images into separate training, test, and validation areas in a 70 to 25 to 5 ratio. To allow for more effective and robust training through larger batch sizes, we evenly cropped the training images into 6 500 by 500 patches as shown in the right over here. Every image from all the dates was used to encourage data diversity for better training. While for the evaluation sets, on the other hand, only the central patch of every third evaluation image was sampled for fair evaluation by ensuring that each tree appears in exactly one image in that set. Therefore, we have the seemingly disparate 50K pairs for training and 63 plus 10 for evaluation, but recall that the area was still split in a standard 70-25-5 ratio. The flight times and dates were varied to encompass challenging lighting and weather conditions within the RT trees dataset. For example, August 30 can be thought of as a normal case, with a midday flight time and clear and warm weather. On October 7, the second row over here, the flight was during dusk, leading to long shadows and lower levels of illumination. And on November 24th, the last row over here, you can see that there's white snow on the ground and a lot of leafless trees, which just adds to the diversity of the dataset. Recall that in this work, we don't have any ground truth annotations for training. However, we annotated image pairs in the evaluation sets in a two-step manner. First, bounding boxes were drawn for tree crowns that are visible in the RGB images, as is typical for object detection datasets. Then, looking at the thermal images, boxes were drawn for the shadowed tree crowns that were not visible in RGB, but apparent in thermal, and then these were marked as difficult to identify. In total, there were 447 difficult trees in the testing set, and these were typically smaller as shown by the distribution of bounding box areas in the left plot, and fewer in number as shown by the distributions per image in the figure on the right. And this is because these boxes tend to correspond to shorter, younger trees that are often crowded out by their larger neighbors. Moving on to the experimental results, we report performance in terms of 3 metrics: AP50, average recall with 100 boxes, and percentage of shadow trees identified. So off-the-shelf Deep Forest RGB baseline performs well for visible trees with a 49% AP50, but can only identify around 10% of shadow trees. Looking at the second row, you can tell that this model is not at all suited to thermal, which means we need to adapt it to making it useful for that modality. We additionally provide results for a supervised fine-tuning experiment, which can be thought of as the target that we want to achieve. And however, this required laborious and time-consuming annotation, which spanned over 2 weeks. Instead, the proposed ShadowSense can achieve comparable performance without any annotations for training, and compared to the off-the-shelf baseline, AP50 is improved by 5% to 55, and percent of shadow trees identified is nearly doubled. As for the other works, the existing image-to-image translation techniques we evaluated performed worse than Deep Forest for this task, and it's a similar case for the fusion techniques as well. Existing UDA techniques require ground truth annotations for training, and without any proxy for detection-specific loss, for example, the proposed foreground FPN feature alignment, the performance is quite poor as well. So here's some visual results for ShadowSense. So for example, looking at the thermal image in the 4th row over here, you can see this tree is not identified by the Deep Forest RGB baseline. However, it's very evident in the thermal, and our ShadowSense model can effectively find that tree, and at the same time it can maintain performance for the visible trees as well in the rest of the image. So to conclude this talk, I'd just like to reiterate that the proposed ShadowSense model outperforms the RGB-only detector by fusing features from both RGB and thermal domains, and thus effectively identifies shadow trees more effectively. This improvement can be attributed to the fact that the proposed training workflow successfully adapts the thermal branch to produce domain invariant feature representations, as shown in this T-SNE visualization. Crucially, unlike previous UDA methods, the proposed method does not require any annotations for training, and instead only uses the co-registered nature of the imagery to guide adaptation. So as some final remarks, I'd like to thank my co-authors and collaborators at the University of Alberta and Natural Resources Canada. I'd also like to thank FRI for funding and Weyerhaeuser for access to the Cynthia cut block. And I'd also like to thank you for listening, so feel free to reach out on LinkedIn if this talk was of any interest to you. Thank you.